This PowerPoint is made up of in-depth research. It contains various facts about the Native Americans of Arkansas in the 17th and 18th century. You will get a look into their hierarchical organization, their roles as men and women, how they dressed, the types of homes they lived in, and how their government was managed. You will also learn how they interacted with the Spanish and the French once they reached their lands, how they managed to coexist, and the negotiations that were made along the way helped both groups thrive in Arkansas for quite a while. The shift of power between the Europeans and the Americans led to an awful turn of events for the Indians. Some of the struggles you will learn about that they faced were rather unethical. It only got worse for them towards the end while America progressed. The Cherokee came from Iroquois lineage and is one of the biggest and integrated tribes of the time. Their name comes from a Creek word that means people of different speech. Some prefer to be called Kitowa or Tzalagi. Historians believe that their tribe consisted of 22,500 members and controlled almost 400,000 miles of land, which are parts of Georgia, Tennessee, North and South Carolina. The Cherokee Nation was composed of two towns, Red and White. War towns where they held the war ceremonies, and peace towns. The chiefs of these war towns were inferior to a superior chief. The peace towns served as refuge for lawbreakers. They used stones made out of tools, knives, axes, and chisels. The Cherokee grew corn, beans, and squash, and hunted large game like deer, bear, and elk, which provided them with meat and clothes. The Cherokee homes had a roof made from bark with a hole at the top to let smoke out. They had no windows and only one door. Their communities would consist of 30 to 16 houses and one council house. Meetings were held at this council house, and a sacred fire would constantly burn. They would hold rituals in here like the busk or green corn, which were fresh fruits and new fire celebration. The Spaniards, French, and English all tried to populate parts of Cherokee lands. They had foreign treaties with them by 18th century, and in trading and military matters, they helped the British during the French and Indian War, while the French sided with the Iroquois, which were natural enemies of the Cherokees. In 1759, the British started destroying a great amount of Native American land, which included the Cherokee. This put their economies at risk, so they had to give over more than 2 million acres to get them out of debt. Quapaw comes from a Siouan word Ugapa, which translates to downstream people. This is because of the location they lived, mostly along the Mississippi River. They are affiliated with the Deja, which is a smaller part of the Siouan language. They are closely related in dialect to the Osage, Omaha, Kansa, and Ponca tribes. They were called Arkansas by the Algonquians, and French is how the state and river got their names. According to Waldman, the ancest part of the word is Siouan for people of the south wind. The art part is taken from the French word arc for bow. It is believed that the Quapaw once lived in the Ohio Valley with the 4 tribes they are related to. They lived in long houses that had rounded roofs which were covered with sheets of bark. They were sometimes covered with grass, animal hides, and woven mats. Some homes even held several families and were set up to accommodate them on the inside. They had platforms along the walls that were meant for sleeping and sitting, and had a fireplace in the middle of the family's to use. Their homes were arranged around a central open plaza, with a council house near it. There was a raised platform where the important people of the tribe would sit during the ceremonies. George Sabo states that each village had also a sacred temple in which religious ceremonies were conducted. The Quapaw sustained themselves by hunting and gathering. The women oversaw all the agricultural process, while the men focused on the hunting, which the women would skin and preserve. Quapaw women handled most of the household chores and cared for their children, while the men waged war and managed community and political affairs. Quapaw women wore skirts that extended from the waist to their knees. Single women wore their long hair loose, while married women had their 2 braided quills secured behind each ear. Men usually went naked during the warm weather, but then later started using loincloths made from buckskin, moccasins, shirts, and leggings. They both wore robes made of buffalo during the winter. Tattoos and strings of beads hanging from their noses and ears were very common. They encountered the French during their early explorations, which included Jacques Marquette and Rene Robert Cavelier de la Salle. Their location along the Mississippi River gave them advantage in playing a very important role during the creation of the Louisiana colonies. They became allies in the 1700s and often did trading with and for the French. These alliances were usually formed with the use of calumet, often referred to as a peace pipe. The Osage also belonged to the same Siouan subdivision as the Quapaw. The native name for the Osage is Niukunska, which relates to people of the Middle Waters, which is what they called themselves. The Osage separated themselves into two groups: the Sky people, whose leader was responsible for peace matters, and the Earth people leader was responsible for war matters. Sabo, the writer of the chapter New Traditions for a New World, wrote, "The Osages were divided into 5 major groups, called bands, each of which had its own village. There was a group of male elders, called the Little Old Men, who, according to George, were responsible for establishing standards for appropriate conduct, advising village leaders, making important decisions affecting tribal affairs in time of peace and war, and maintaining sacred knowledge and traditions." The Osages layout in their homes and villages represented the dimensions of the universe. George Sabo III describes the arrangement of these houses as arranged on either side a main road running east to west, which symbolized the earth's surface between the sky above and the earth below. The 2 village leaders lived on opposite sides of the main road in the center of the village. Their homes were rectangular and oval, and like the Quapaw, were also covered with woven mats, sheets, or bark, and buffalo hides. Women did the constructing of the houses, agricultural duties, and household duties. The men handled wars, political, and economic matters, as well as protected the villages. Men would wear leggings, moccasins, and loincloths. They had shaved heads with only a scalp lock, which was a long strand of hair from the top to the bottom of their heads. They were sometimes different to separate from the other clans. Tattoos were common, and body paint were used for special ceremonies. Women wore dresses made from deerskin that were fastened tightly at the waist with a belt. Their hair was long and loose. The Osage women would also wear tattoos as well as perfume and scented powders. In 1673, the Osage were visited by the French explorers Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet. Members of the tribe would barter with the French traders. They exchanged furs for horses, guns, and European manufactured goods. This gave the Osage more power over other tribes in the area. The Osage would call all the white men Inshtahe, which relates to heavy eyebrows, since they seemed awfully hairy to the Osage. Whenever the land was bought by the president at the time, Thomas Jefferson, the Osage did not know how to act, so they were hostile towards them. Whenever the Osage were pushed off their land onto reservations, years later they found oil and natural gas on their lands. People tried to overtake these lands once again, but unfortunately they could not. Another source of income they received is from 3 casinos on their lands. The Caddo or multiple tribes that came together from the Red River in Arkansas through Texas and all the way down to Louisiana. Caddo comes from their name Caddohochee, which means real chiefs. Their religion consists of many spiritual beings. Their most powerful spirit was Akadi Ame, which was a supreme being and had control over the other spiritual beings. The Caddo were separated into clans. The clan came from either the mother or the father, whichever was considered the strongest or the most powerful. Their homes were relatively large. They sometimes reached 60 feet in diameter. It was constructed in a circle that had woven pieces of bark in between the poles, holding the shape together. Later, bundles of grass thatch were used to cover it and finally crowned with a grass figure. The caddy was a male who oversaw the construction of houses and planting of fields and harvesting. He was there to keep order and assign tasks to each person. Hunting and gathering was their main source of food. They gathered nuts, berries, seeds, and edible roots. They hunted for buffalo, bear, deer, and smaller mammals and birds for important activities, as were fishing and gathering shellfish, according to George Sabo III. Since the cattle lived close to salt marshes, they boiled the water and stored salt. This salt was used for trading of other materials and needed. In Sabo's chapter, New Traditions for a New World, cattle were well known for their pottery, baskets, woven mats, and dress skins. Their pottery had intricate designs, especially for the vessels used in special occasions. Besides women also wove baskets which had multiple uses, storage, or used in rituals.